What we're really interested in is thinking about poverty and deprivation across different countries in Europe, and in particular how the way in which people live together in households affects poverty and deprivation. Typically, poverty and deprivation are measured at the household level, and we assume that everybody within the household shares that same experience. What we're able to use here is measures of individual deprivation for adults and deprivation for children, which are based on an index of items that are asked about in the survey that ask whether the individual is able to afford, for example, to have 2 pairs of properly fitting shoes, and equivalent items for children, such as having books in the home, for example. If an adult is unable to afford 2 out of the 7 items, or in the case of children, that the children are unable to afford 3 out of the 11 items in the index, then we count that as deprivation. A simple household we would think of as a single adult or a couple with or without their dependent children. That means they're young children. A complex household then is a household that has, in addition, 1 or more other adults. Typically that would be an adult sibling, a grown-up sibling who hasn't left home or who has returned home, or it might be elderly parents. So 1/3 of adults across Europe live in more complex households, and about 1/5 of children. If you move across to Eastern Europe, you've got much higher proportions of people living in these complex households. One of the approaches that we took was to move away from looking at deprivation as something that affects a household as a whole. And so scratching beneath the surface, if you like, of what's going on for the household as a whole, we were able to identify that there are inequalities within households. In households where the income that people were bringing into the household was unequal, the person who was bringing in a smaller share of the income was much more likely to experience individual deprivation. That's the case across the board on average, but it's particularly so in the case of these complex households. We found that compared to being the sole contributor to household income, if you were not contributing anything to the household income, your risk of personal deprivation was 1/5 higher. That's hidden in our usual way of assessing deprivation, because our usual way of assessing deprivation is just a household measure. On the whole, on average, women are less likely to be bringing in the lion's share of household income, therefore particularly affects women's risk of deprivation. So when it comes to thinking about children, we find that they're strongly protected from deprivation by living with parents and grandparents. That's also the case for children living in lone parent families with adult siblings, so with grown-up siblings also sharing the household, although it's a much smaller effect, a much smaller protective effect. So for children, complex households are on the whole protective. Interestingly, we find a number of cases in a number of countries where the grandparents appear to be sharing their resources with their children and grandchildren in such a way that actually produces deprivation for the grandparents themselves. Just over 1/4 of non-deprived children who are living in households with grandparents have grandparents who are themselves deprived. The findings from this project really emphasise the importance of looking within the household and not simply treating the household as a single unit with everybody having exactly the same experience within the household. A second implication is to think about who earnings or benefits or tax credits are going to within a household. It matters who a benefit is paid to, for example. It matters whether taxation is at an individual level or a household level. It matters when we're creating employment opportunities, whether we're thinking about the incentives for second earners within the household as well as the primary earner.